Minnesota country. It could be in the land of the midnight sun.
I said it would be a cold night when I came back here, and it was.
That's the voice of Lee Konitz. And Lee, you may have been here with Stan Kenton's band, and I don't know what other memorable nights here in Minnesota, but I remember you having dialogue with Lennie Tristano at a Chinese restaurant called Confucius. And we in the audience would have wonton soup while you played those beautiful lyrical lines, and Lennie's imagination would stimulate you, and there was great interplay. Those must have been wonderful days at Confucius.
Well, it was difficult smelling the sweet and sour pork between hot phrases, I must say. It's a little sweet after a while, but it was very stimulating and very nice, yes.
No relation to opium or anything like that.
No, unfortunately, it was nothing like that.
Well, you both were doing a lot of composing on the stand in those long hours and experimenting. What was happening to your music, and what was happening with Lennie there at the keyboard in those long nights at Confucius?
Well, we were just trying to figure out how to do it, that kind of composing in a group. It was difficult for Lennie particularly to relate to rhythm sections specifically and get the whole music in one kind of frame of reference. So frequently at Confucius, I remember there was that problem existing. We made one record, half of which was live from Confucius, and there is some indication of what that music sounded like then on that record, an Atlantic record. Do you happen to know that one? And so if one listens to that closely, one can hear the discrepancy that I'm referring to, I think. But other than that, it was just a case of trying, as I'm still trying tonight here with these people that I've just met tonight, 20 minutes before we played our first set, to do the same thing, to try to get some common ground and compose together. I've been fortunate to be able to attempt that for many years, and as Pete Hamill mentioned when we did an interview recently, he said, "We'll do it until we get it right." That's about it.
I can remember Bobby Hackett saying that also. Well, Lee, I guess that is the goal of all artists. You do it until it's right.
Well, this in particular is a rare kind of opportunity for players, as long as they can stay interested in the subject. At this point now, I have gained some kind of seniority rights, I think. I never thought I'd see the day when I could claim that unique distinction, but I can now. Jazz, as you know, has been getting a nod lately from various sources, so the people who are still trying to do something are acknowledged in one way or another, and I feel very fortunate to be able to continue to try to play.
Lee Konitz, it's a pleasure talking with you here at the Rainbow Gallery on a very cold night in Minnesota, and it's good to see you again. I can still smell the wonton soup and the sweet and sour pork at Confucius between Broadway and 8th Avenue.
Well, you might be smelling that on me right now, because I just came from a Japanese restaurant.
Which is no accident or accident. I've been talking with Lee Konitz, and thanks very much.
Thank you.
The snow is coming down in Minnesota. Lee Konitz is over here. He represents what might have been classified at one time as a cool school, and that seems to have passed into limbo and history in jazz. But
feels like at least one lifetime ago.
Somehow. Lee, you spent a time with a Stan Kenton organization that involved the writings of Jerry Mulligan, your own performances, and just a great group of young bloods of that day and time under the wing of Stan. And he represents something very special in music. You, from the Reed section, could observe him on the bus from night to night. What kind of a man is he from your point of view?
Well, he was very, and still is, very dedicated to this whole conception of playing, well, in his case, concerted music, rather orchestrated music. He's a good, let's say, band leader to begin with. He was a very good leader of the group, and everyone respected him as the leader of the band. It was calling the shots, so to speak, and I think he did it very well. And as I mentioned earlier to Bob Trotzman, I just received some tapes from. I mentioned that to you just now. You were sitting over there then. You look like Bob Trotzman over there a little bit.
His hair's a little longer.
I've just 25 years later gotten some copies of some of the radio shows that we did together at that time, and the band sounded good, and he sounded all with it, just making the best possible presentation of this group of people who he really liked very much. I think he enjoys being the head of a group of young, aspiring players, and he was the father figure, and everyone grooved around that, as they say.
For you, Lee, what the environment of the Kenton Band certainly gave you some learning experience and conditioning that was quite different from the settings you'd originally been in, small combinations, of course.
Right. It was a very unique opportunity to associate with a large group of people and travel around together and make music together, and it's like a whole little world on that bus that's pretty much separate from the stationary world, so to speak. We're just kind of the young nomads traveling around and spreading theta, as they say, wherever we went, one way or another, which was a great treat for a youngster especially. Good Lord, it was very exciting. And there's the opportunity to learn all of those nice disciplines that go with sitting in a section and doing your part, whatever it is, well, blending with the next man, and that whole total feeling of being a part of an organization that's making it. It was quite a nice experience, and some of the music was very good, very well done, and I was fortunate enough, I think, to have recorded some with the band, and I got some things that I can listen to today and still enjoy.
For you, you called it theta in the Kenton Band.
Yes.
Lee Konitz, that's a good word to leave on. Views of Stan Kenton and his organization and a group of young bloods, a wave that produced the sound of Jerry Mulligan on a grander scale, and the sound of Lee Konitz and other colleagues. Really Mulligan doing scoring and not performing with the band so much.
Right, he played with the band a little while too, but it was mostly as a writer, and he excelled in that area. I always thought that was his forte.
A kind of far cry from the days when he was doing things for Claude Thornhill in a muted way as against the Kenton.
But it was still essentially that kind of very danceable, very melodic swing music that he was capable of doing. And I had the impression that later on, when he got his own band, many years later, he didn't write as much for it. He kind of commissioned other people to write for that band, I believe. I'm not positive. But it seemed like by that time he had lost that urge somehow, maybe.
Lee Konitz and some comments about Mulligan and Kenton. If you're traveling to New York, you might run into a glamorous lady by the name of Olivia Taylor, strikers, and then 9 strong people making music. Or it might be the Village Vanguard, Max Gordon's place. For not only does Thad Jones and Mel Lewis keep the light alive for jazz in the Village, but a man by the name of Lee Konitz also lights the fire. Lee, your adventures at Strikers produced a 9-piece organization. Actually, it was a project for a tour to Italy that never materialized, as I understand. Yeah. And I was just looking, about an hour and a half ago at the listing of some of the compositions in one of the albums, and it ran the gamut from Chick Corea to Edgar Sampson. Well, when I heard you with Jerry Mulligan's small groups and those counterpoints and chases that you and Mulligan ran, I'm sure that no matter what the date and the composer, you just like good music, and it has to have some sort of movement. How about the Nonet?
Well, I like to use that as an opportunity to get some of the great classic music, jazz, in quotes, if you will, to play. I have a 6-horn group, 3-rhythm, and they're made up of people who are working as professional journeyman players during the day, doing their jingles or whatever, and look forward to coming out at night to get to play some. Ronnie Cuba on baritone, a virtuoso baritone player. Jimmy Nepper, trombone. Bert Collins, trumpet, etc. They're all first-rate players. And last night we played at Strikers, and the band was sounding pretty good and having a good time. It's an opportunity to get the classic music in and to get new music in. I like to play, as you say, the best music possible, whatever it is, if it's traditional or experimental, so-called.
With the Nonet, you're working with more structure, aren't you, than you would? What is your aim and your objective? You want it, I suppose, to be fresh and to move, but in the compositions themselves, what are you looking for?
Mainly to get the improvised kind of conception orchestrated as a development, rather than the traditional structure with the solo immersed in the structure somehow. I'm trying to get an improvising small band concept that has the benefits of an ensemble. After you've heard some good playing, it's nice to hear some counterpoint and then to hear some chords and to hear some concerted playing, and that's what I'm trying to get this to be.
You're truly doing some composing against the composition itself.
Right.
Is that the way to describe it?
Well, that's one way, yes.
Improvisation's another word, of course, but really what you're doing is restructuring the composition in a way, aren't you, as a 9-man orchestra?
Well, that's it. But specifically, it's the idea of starting as though it's just a horn player with a rhythm section, because that's a special feeling that is not generally possible after a band a brass section is belted out a written part. The feeling to play afterwards different somehow than it is starting that way and having the brass section follow the solo in some way.
How would you describe that feeling?
Well, it's just more open in some way, playing with just a rhythm section. That's why I've preferred to do that over the years. It's just looser in some way. After a written expression with a number of horns, the feeling is generally more set. And I remember last night just feeling like by the time I stood up to play, it was locked into a certain place, and that was it. It was the groove had been established, and it was just very much different than just playing with the rhythm section. It's hard to describe right now somehow, but It's stronger in some ways because of the hit of the ensemble on the reaction of the rhythm section to such a thing. It's louder and it's stronger in some way, and all those things affect the nature of the improvising. The improvising frequently tends to be more fixed in that ensemble thing. It's a little harder to take the kind of chances. Does that say anything? It's a little vague to me.
Oh, well, perhaps my question was vague, but it sounds like you have a stimulus for priming everyone.
I don't still get what you're saying.
Well, it sounds to me as if this concept that you've described really sets the scene and stimulates each player and the ensembles as well in a very special sort of way, which I'm not sure I have understood totally, except that I hear it on a record of the Nonet.
I think we ought to erase this one and try this again, because between the two of us, I don't know if we're going to get the public radio public to understand this particular difference.
Well, I think we've thoroughly confused everybody, Lee, and I think we ought to leave it right here.
I'm getting out of here.
Well, that's one interviewer that's driven another jazz musician right out of his head. Lee Konitz over there on intermission at the Rainbow Gallery.
The 9-piece group that you're referring to, distinct from a 16-piece group in terms of the large orchestra type, Mel Lewis, Thad Jones, Stan Kenton, etc., or, on the other hand, the horn or two horns with a rhythm section is what we're trying to clarify some way. The 9-piece has the opportunity, or I think of as the best of both worlds. It has 6 horns, and it has the impact of a big band in the writing aspect. And it has the possibility for the improvising and the loose kind of spontaneous improvising that happens in a small band. Now, the difference between starting, and this is what I was trying to describe, like last night, the room that we were playing in, Strikers, was packed with all, people. And my thought in trying to select the next piece is to take something that I know is going to get a sound that is well arranged and conceived of and can just get into a groove right away. As opposed to with a small band, frequently you just kind of start playing, whether there's a full house or not, and try to make it happen, the whole thing then. With the arrangement, it's set up, it's structured in that way. So, to me, that becomes a bit of a trap, in a way. The arrangement is sounded, and then the improvising happens. And the improvising in the structure is different than it is when it starts the process. As a developmental part of the process, it's different than as a setup to the process. So what I'm trying to say is that my ideal is to improvise into the structure, into the arranged part. I think once someone hears some good soloists play for a while, they would then be ready to hear harmony and counterpoint and all the nice things that can happen from writing for a group of instruments. If that's any clearer, that's closer to what I have in mind with this group.
Here then, looks like you're collecting cups too. I'm sorry.
Yes, that's all right.
That's quite all right.
I really don't mean to.
Around New York in 1947, very active, Charlie Parker. And of course, that is a legend. And hovering around just out of Chicago, Lee Konitz, listening to Charlie Parker. Your observations of him at the time that he was playing around New York in 1947.
Well, I had heard some of the 78s, the first ones that came came out in '45, and was quite overwhelmed at this new music. I wasn't really quite ready for that yet. My frame of reference was pretty much Benny Carter by that time, and Charlie came along and introduced a kind of music that I was too young to really get with yet. But a year or so later, I got to know it better, and it was the most important music then in jazz. And I came to New York, and it was strange as I think back of it. When I heard him at the Three Deuces, was the first place I heard him in. After just having heard those few 78s, he already sounded very familiar to me. I always had the impression that what he was playing, I'd heard him play before in some way. And I've always had that impression of Charlie, as prolific a musician as he was. His output was extraordinary, as we all know by now. The jury is in on that, certainly. But all of it was so well done and so specific that it always sounded familiar. It was hardly ever Warren Marsh is a case in point to me. He's a tenor player that I was associated with Lennie Tristano, as you recall. And he's still playing brilliantly. Always a surprise to me. We toured Europe together recently, and night after night, standing next to him, it was always something to just have to pay very close attention to, or was compelled to pay very close attention to. Charlie, in some way, had a different kind of brilliance. It was so startlingly brilliantly done, but always familiar in some way. Does that make any sense to you? You know what I mean?
Absolutely does. My chance to hear him was a little bit like yours some 3 years later. And I only got to hear him on a few occasions at Birdland with strings, laboring with his string groups that Norman Granz helped him put together.
Well, of course, some of that was funny, but also he played in a more accessible way with that group, and he personally, and I believe this, liked the fact, I think, that he could communicate on the level that he was able to with that background. The more, again, the small group, more experimental playing, if you will, or loose, extended playing was a little more creative in a way. That was his basic playing, and then he was able to take the essence of that playing and put it into that string context and reach a lot more of an audience. So I enjoyed that also very much on that level. Incidentally, they just released some broadcast. Columbia Records has bought up some of the old bootleg tapes and wire recordings or whatever these Ganiffs picked up in New York, and we all thank these thieves for doing that, because we get to hear some of the music that we wouldn't have heard anyway. But nevertheless, it has been done to me too, and I have a bit of a resentment, first of all, if they release something that I didn't like, and second of all, of course, we never get paid for it. But the Columbia decided they're going to do it anyway, so they might as well process the sound and put it out as representative as possible of the music.